Well, hello my friends. I am back with our question and answer series. This is where I answer your questions, the most frequent questions that I get. I'm going to come in and just do a quick video and try to answer those questions so that you can get some more tools for your tool belt and help your creative process, your creative journey, and that kind of thing. So today we're talking about wash and glaze. The two I use often, and there's been a lot of confusion as to what exactly is a wash, why would I use a wash versus a glaze, that kind of thing. So I'm just going to kind of talk over that a little bit today. So typically I use raw umber or burnt umber, some kind of brown kind of thing, to do either a wash or a glaze. And I do that because I want a real vintage feel, a grungy feel. I have a lot of texture, and a wash will help either push things back and give it that grungy feel, or it will help accentuate texture because it gets in the grooves. A wash or a glaze, it will get in the grooves and that kind of thing. So I want to kind of do a little bit of that, show you the difference between the wash and the glaze and how I mix it up, and then I'm going to show you how you can use color with your glaze as well. I don't use a lot of color with my glazes. If I do, again, it's very neutral because I'm going for kind of a grungy, vintage, antique yellow kind of thing. So I'll use, sometimes I'll use like a yellow ochre or a caramel color, or trying to think if I use any other colors. I might use like a nickel azel gold, something like that. And I'm also going to share the different types of paints that you can use and if it makes a difference. So let's just quickly go over the difference between a wash and a glaze, and then we'll kind of dissect it from there and go into a little bit more detail. So I am just going to put some, and this is a medium body acrylic paint. It's like a craft paint thickness. It's not a heavy body, but it's not a fluid. So it's kind of middle of the road. That's why I like these paints. But I use, gosh, you guys, I use everything and anything I can. But you can see that it stands up, but it's not completely fluid. But it is fluid enough that it kind of moves around a little bit. And I use this paint, I use fluid acrylics, I use heavy bodies, and I'm going to show you that in just a second. But for now, we're going to use this because this is middle of the road, and this is probably what everyone has. So for a wash, I've got some, and I'm going to put another one over here. I'm working on my palette. This is a clipboard with parchment paper on it. That is my palette. That's another question that I get often. I like it because I can take the papers out and reuse them and create texture, that kind of thing. Plus it's easy to create with. So for a wash, this is going to be our wash over here. I've taken my brush. This is a 1-inch brush. It's different than the brush that I use for my matte medium, and I've gotten it really wet. It's dripping. And I'm just going to pull my raw umber out here, and I'm going to dip my brush right back into the water and just kind of get that nice and wet and juicy, and you can see how wet that is. So that's all there is. That's all that there is to a wash. And I've got a piece of paper here that has some gesso down, and I also put some matte medium over it because I want it to be the same surface that I'm usually always creating on. And I'm going to show you the difference between a primed surface or a non-porous surface and a porous surface or non-primed piece of paper. And there's a huge, huge difference. So this has got gesso down and it's got matte medium over the top because typically I put papers down and I put matte medium. So I want to try and get the best likeness to what I would be using when I create. So this is my wash, and it's super watery, and if I lay it down and I find that it's not watery enough, I just stick my brush back into my water and just add water to it. I don't add anything else. and it's really, really watery. You can see how it's moving. And then I will come back and pull that up. And you can see the subtle difference there. It's very light. I like to come back in and add splatters or different things like that to kind of give it a tea-stained look, and I will do that and just kind of come back in and tap that up. And then I like to dry it right away. And kind of pull up as I'm drying. And you can see how that gives it a real tea-stained, coffee-stained kind of feel. I can come back in after it's dry and add more color to it, another layer to it to add it to make it a little bit darker. But what this does, the wash, why I like the wash is because it's unpredictable. It's kind of like watercolor. You're not exactly, you don't know where things are going to pool. It's very uneven, and like you can do this water stain. It can be very, very light. So if I come in here and just pull it all back, it can be very light. And so that's why I like the wash. Now, it doesn't work as well as a glaze when you've got texture. And I've got a separate sheet of paper that's got texture, and you're going to see the difference. So that's a wash, just plain straight wash. You can see what you can do as far as getting some coffee stain kind of look, that kind of thing. And that's one of the main reasons why I like a wash, because I can come in and just drop in some paint, start to dry it, and then pull it up, and you get a real tea-stained feel. Okay, so now let's talk about a glaze. So a glaze, you add glazing medium, and there's a ton out there, just absolutely a ton. There's golden. That's probably one of the most expensive ones I use, and I know there's a ton more. These are the ones I use, and I really don't use Golden's glaze very often. If anything, I use Liquitex or I use DecoArt, and if I had a choice between the two, I choose DecoArt. This is the one I use most often. It's available in any craft store. It's super inexpensive, and it does the job. So glazing medium extends the time. Let me shake that up just a little bit. Extends the time of your paint. So where the wash will dry fast because it's water, this is going to give you some extended time to play and move and push that paint around. That's what the glaze is for. Glaze is for lots of layering. And how I mix my glaze is I do not pour my glaze directly into my paint. I will put my paint to the side, pull it out, and then come into my glaze and pull my glaze into the paint, because I have better control at seeing just how dark. So that's very dark. So I want to bring some more of that glaze into, so I pull my glaze into my paint. You can see I've used very little paint, and I will mix that up. In fact, I'm going to add more glaze. And you can do a test. You can see how that's lightened up compared to what was over here originally, depending on what you want. See, so I've added more paint. You can see how the difference of the color is. So the more glaze you add, the lighter your color is going to be. Glazing is great when you have a lot of texture. And so I'm going to, you're going to see here in just a second the difference between a glaze and a wash. So I've just put my glaze down. I've got a clean part of my rag. I'm going to pull that up. And you can see how it's picked up the texture of my gesso on there really, really well, opposed to this. And of course I can wet my rag and pull some of that up, but you can see that it doesn't move. It's not as fluid. but it's going to give you some more working time. You can, and until you really actually dry it, you can see that you can pull it back up, kind of work that out. Now, the one thing about glaze is it's kind of tricky, is that if you have a glazed area and you come back in and you glaze back over it, a lot of times because of that glaze, it will pull up some of the underneath. You can see here, I went over it with my glaze here, and it pulls up the underneath layer. It's trying to mix everything together. It's just a whole different animal as far as the look. But it's the best on texture, because it just picks up all the crevices, all the nooks and crannies, all that yummy good stuff that so often we're trying to show off. You can see I'll come back in and I'll do that tapping process like I did with this to pick up, and it's just 100% different. You don't get that kind of watery, tea stained kind of look. It's going to really do exactly what you're doing. There's no variation. I can come back over and kind of soften that out a little bit, and you know, it's still picked up the, you can see all the brush strokes from the gesso in there. Hope you can see that. So it's very different and yet somewhat the same, but you can see the effects and how they're different. Okay. All right, so I have two scrap pieces of paper here that I have put some super heavy gesso on so that I've got some texture. And I'm going to do a glaze and I'm going to do a wash on both sides, on each of them, so that you can see the difference. So let me grab my brush here, wipe this out. And let's get a wash mixed up, and I'll do this one. So I'm just going to get that nice and wet and juicy, and I'll just come over and lay this down, and you can see how let me wipe it up, and it'll make sense in a second. So I'm just adding some water to my brush, and then I'm going to come back with my rag and start picking this up. And I'll rub it off. And so you can see how it has made this darker, and it's kind of collected in some of the grooves and the cracks in the actual super heavy gesso. But it's not really accentuating or gathering around the piece. So with the wash, you kind of have to make that happen. So if you want to use the wash and you want it to be super heavy around your pieces, you kind of have to do a little bit of dabbing, but even still, it doesn't work quite as well. So a lot of times I will use the wash, so I will come over and just, whoops, I just got way too much paint on there. And of course, too, you can thicken it up so that it's not quite so light. So, but even with that amount of paint and water that I put on there, you can see that it's still not really collecting too much around the edges of that texture. And that's really why I use a glaze when I've got texture, because I really want it to accentuate it. So when I am using a wash for this type of application, typically I want it to be like a tea stain. So I will just dab it on there, and I'll start drying. can look at how gorgeous that is. That just looks like an old weathered piece of paper. Oh, makes me happy. But it does lay on top. If I went back in and tried to pick that up while it was still pretty wet, I would get rid of all of the texture around, or all of the color around there. So that's a wash on texture. It's wonderful. It's great for certain applications. What I like to use a wash. I like to use a glaze. I'm gonna drive you crazy with figuring out, am I a wash or a glaze? So I like to use a glaze when I'm really wanting to accent the texture. So I'm going to put some more glaze out here. I'm going to pull my paint into my glaze. Really get that mixed up. I'm checking to see how dark that is. Maybe a tiny bit more paint. I'm darkening it up because the background of this is pretty dark. And now I'm going to get in there and scrub on the glaze here. Get that on there. And in both cases, you don't want to wait too long to pick things back up unless you're in a really humid and wet climate. But you can see right away how the glaze stays where you put it. There's very little unpredictability. It's going to go exactly where you put it, and it's collecting. I hope you can see that it's collecting around and down in those edges because it stays where you put it. And immediately it really accents those textured areas. And then what I typically do is I'll spray a little bit of alcohol on my rag and come back over the textured areas and lighten it up. But it's collected in all of those grooves. Look at all that. And then you can come back over many times to add additional glaze. Like I could come back in and add more if I wanted to. Come back in down here, add some more. And you want to make sure you have a clean rag when you're picking up your paint, because otherwise you're just moving paint around. Look at that, that's gorgeous. And I hope you can see the difference. So you don't get that watery, grungy feel. But you don't get all of the collection and you don't have as much control. With the glaze you have a lot of control. You don't have as much freedom as far as when you're putting everything down. It's pretty much how you put it down is how it's, where it's going to be. I mean, of course we're coming back over and, picking it back up, but it does a wonderful job at getting down into those grooves. Oh, so good. So that's the difference between a wash and a glaze. So now let's look at a couple of examples of how you can use a wash and a glaze. Okay, so now let's add some color to our glazes. I know a lot of artists who use glazes in colors, and I need to put that into my repertoire more often. But, oh, you know what, I need to put two out here. I'll put the... So I'm using yellow ochre, and I'm using English red oxide. And again, these are regular medium body paints, like a craft paint. So I'm going to do a wash. Oh, you know what? I didn't need to do that. Okie dokie. But the one thing that you have to remember, oh, I got a little bit of brown in there. When you are putting color over color, you have to think about what color it's, because if I put a yellow over the top of that blue, it's going to go greenish. So you have to think about that, and I wanted to mention that because a lot of times you can go for a color and then it changes the look of what you've got. So this is a wash. And I'll come back in and just kind of pick this up. And this yellow is a lot of times the color that I use if I go for a color, because again, it makes it feel kind of vintagey and antique. But that bright, that teal kind of goes, it changes colors. The pink color kind of has a orangish tint to it. So just keep that in mind. So I'm going to add quite a bit of water here. Pick up just a little bit and try to dry some of that, get some of that water stain look. Okay, so you can kind of see how it's going to dull or change your colors underneath, so keep that in mind. And the more extreme color or opposite color of what you're working with, it's going to change it a lot. So I've got some English red oxide out here. Oh, you know what? I was going to do a glaze on this side. So let me grab my glazing medium. Alright, I'm pulling my color together to meet my, that's good. So now I'll do a glaze on this side. And all the colors, you know, you can do this over texture, over your papers. You could really have fun with different color glazes, adding lots of interest to your pieces. But just keep in mind that it will change. So this yellow over here almost kind of goes away. It goes to real orangey feel, and the green's muted down. So just keep that in mind if you're doing colors with your glazes or your washes. So washes are more unpredictable, glazes are very predictable. And see how smooth and shiny and even that is, whereas the one with the wash is not. It's very uneven, very watery. See the difference. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so I'm going to go bright with my colors for a glaze so you can see the difference. I've got a glaze here and I've got some teal. Pull that out and mix those together. And I've got a relatively neutral image, and I'm going to show you how fun this can be if you choose to do a colored glaze. It can take a fairly neutral image and add just a touch of color to it. Which can be really fun in a lot of applications. So I'm just pulling that back. And this is a glaze. And it's got that tint to it now of teal. So it can be, you can use it in some really fun applications. And I'm going to do a wash now on this one. Same color. Pull this over here with my water. And again, keep in mind that that color is going to change the brightness of your whatever color you've got going on underneath. But it's a lot of fun to take some of that neutral background and add a tiny bit of color. And so I'm just going to dab it up here. You can see how pretty is that. We can come back in with our wash, add some splotchiness. Tap that back just a little bit, give it a dry. So right before it's dry, just come back in and pick up all the rest of those spots. And it leaves this really cool kind of shadowy effect, water rings, water spots kind of thing. But look at how fun that is with the wash. So we've got some color going on, and then we've got this kind of unpredictable water stain effect. So lots of fun options, and just get in there and play, play, play. All right, so let's talk about paints. Okay, so there's a lot. We do our wash or our glaze with acrylic paints, and you can use all different kinds. This is a fluid acrylic, which I love using with my washes or my glazes, and the reason being is because it's thinner. So let me pour this out. It's very, very fluid, so when I will tip it, it will run without anything in it. So what that means is that the concentration of color is higher as opposed to something like this once we get it watered down. So to get this really watery, I need to add very little water to that, and look at how rich that color is. I mean, add very little water to it. And I've got a really deep color because the pigment of the paint is so rich because it's a fluid. I have to water it down less so you get more color. Same thing with a, this is a acrylic high flow. So let me put a little bit of this out, hopefully. I'm terrible. Oh, it's not even open. Terrible at closing my caps, so it's not unlikely that, let me grab one that's open, that things are clogged, because that's very typical for me. So, all right, so this is a high flow. This is like ink almost. It's so fluid. And so again, you have to add very little water to it. Look at how pigmented, how pigmented and bright that is with just the water that's on my brush. Bright and bold. So there's a lot of options as far as when you're wanting to do a wash. Now let's talk about a heavy body. Let me grab a new palette paper. Okay, so out here on my palette I have got, this is a Winsor Newton. This is a heavy body paint. And all of the acrylics you can use this basically the same way. However, to get this really watery, you have to use a lot of water. A lot. To get it to a really juiciness like you want. And the only problem with that is once you add water, it breaks down the pigment. So it might not be as strong as what you would want. So you just have to keep that in mind. Now with glaze, let's do this with some glazing medium. Same thing, you have to add more glaze to it because it's so thick. So I'm going to bring my paint over here. To get it to a nice consistency, you have to add quite a bit of glaze. And so you can see how it's not quite mixed up all the way. And so that can be somewhat of a problem if you're using a heavy body paint. So let's do that with where is it? Okay. Let's do that with the fluid acrylic. And rinse my brush out. Grab some glaze here. I need very little glaze because this is already so nice and fluid. That's beautiful. So if you have a certain type of paint, all of this will work with that paint. I just want to show you some examples and let you think about what types of paint you're using. Craft paint's great. That's basically the consistency of these for the most part. This might be a little bit thicker than craft paint, but they're pretty close. Then you've got your fluids, your high flow or your fluid acrylics, and those give you great pigment, and I love using those for my washes or my glazes. Okay, let me think. Is there anything else that I wanted to talk to you about? I think we went over everything. We talked about washes, glazes, different paints, doing different colors on top, and texture, right? Yes, yes, yes. Where is our texture? All right, so I hope this answers your questions to what the difference between a wash and a glaze is. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask. It is really my joy to help you in your creative process. And I get super excited about talking about supplies and paints and techniques. It's my thing. I love it. So don't hesitate to ask any questions. And two, if you have any other questions about any other products or techniques or different things like that, ask them, because I will take those questions and use that in this series to help you in whatever you're having a question about. So, all right, my friends, quick and easy answers to your questions. All right, I will see you on Sunday.